From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Tuesday, March 4, 2025. The White House seems determined to keep its spat with Ukraine going, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio accusing President Zelensky of Ukraine-splaining. That's after Donald Trump and JD Vance said Zelensky was ungrateful. Both the Australian government and the opposition say they want to support a UK-led coalition of the willing, but won't commit troops on the ground. Food producers and retailers, as well as charities that feed the needy, say the government has failed to address the cost of living crisis, soaring costs of energy and fuel. That's an exclusive live now at theaustralian.com.au. 'Tis the season for politicians in Hawaiian shirts to sit down with their glowing partners to reveal the real me. And Anthony Albanese's found a new ultra-sympathetic outlet, the longform podcast interview. But what are we learning about politicians in their new favourite medium? That's today's episode. We've all watched politicians for at least a decade try to be relatable on social media.
All right, let's make a sandwich, eh?
Back by popular demand, it's Jane's cocktail hour, and can I tell you, after 1 week of campaigning, Mummy needs a cocktail.
Hey TikTok, thought I'd hop on here to let you know the big news we're announcing today.
It's usually horrifying.
Did you know Anthony Albanese is on TikTok? Because I had no idea, and it appears that not many other people did either.
That's Kristen Amiot, producer of The Front and The Australian's podcast critic.
I really think I'd prefer him in a hard hat and high-vis somewhere.
The advent of social media was meant to mean politicians didn't need boring old journalists with their tricky questions anymore. They could go direct to the people.
Hi there, PM here. I'm back with your weekend reminder that the right to disconnect is now law.
But now they've thought of a new way to avoid the tough questions. Podcasts. But not podcasts like the one you're listening to. Podcasts like this.
Here's what I'm wearing for the most important interview of my life. Trousers. That's how serious it is, guys. I'm in trousers.
That's reality TV star and radio host Abby Chatfield, prepping for an interview with Anthony Albanese.
This actually is like consequential. And I've got 12 pages of notes, and I feel like that feeling the night before a uni presentation.
She's the host of podcast It's a Lot with Abby Chatfield. It covers everything from sex to feminism, a lot more sex, and relationships. She's smart and funny, and the show has been near the top of the Australian podcast charts since 2019.
Welcome to It's a Lot podcast, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese.
Great to be here, Abby.
Over the course of about 90 minutes, the PM got time to wheel out all his lines.
The intervention that we've done has really looked after low and middle income earners.
The Middle East.
The right of both Israelis and Palestinians to live in peace and security with prosperity.
The Voice.
So we did that, and it didn't work out. I accept that, and we accept the result.
The Other Guy.
Talk to everyone and engage. Peter Dutton doesn't.
And he just reeled off the talking points.
He did. When I initially pitched that story, I perhaps naively assumed that Anthony Albanese would make some kind of announcement, would maybe elaborate on some of his policy agenda. We are pretty close to a federal election now. It hasn't been called yet, but it is coming. But really all I got was everything that I've already heard in the press conferences that have happened really over the course of the last 12 months, if not longer.
My strategy was to kind of give a problem, a criticism of the government, and then let him answer and reply. This wasn't because I didn't want to debate him. It wasn't because I didn't want to prove him wrong. It was just a timing thing. But I really appreciate...
That's not to say she gave a bad interview, but it's an opportunity, I think, for us to step back and understand what the objective is of these podcast interviews and what we as voters and as listeners want out of them.
Yeah, I think the last thing a lot of politicians want to do is sit down with a newspaper journalist who's going to dig through their policies one by one, looking for a splash, a news story that the politician doesn't necessarily want to be out there. That's what we're always looking for. So politicians for years now, 40 years, 50 years, have been going on kind of light entertainment programs in an effort to make themselves seem more relatable. Peter Costello dancing on Kerry-Anne Kennedy's midday show. John Hewson blowing himself up on A Current Affair.
If I buy a birthday cake from a cake shop and GST is in place, do I pay more or less for that birthday cake?
Well, it will depend whether cakes today in that shop are subject to sales tax or they're not.
Which I must say is not light entertainment. It was one of the greatest news interviews in Australian television history. But even when they go on shows like Today or Sunrise, they get a hard time.
This is under your watch. How do you feel about that?
Well, I know what it's like to do it tough, Nat.
It seems like the appeal of going on a 90-minute podcast is just that it's a nice, cosy, warm blanket and they don't really get challenged.
I think that's absolutely right. I was looking through the kind of slate of other podcast interviews that Anthony Albanese and, to a lesser extent, Peter Dutton have done this year. And strangely enough, cricket is widely represented in this list.
We literally have the Prime Minister of the country just interrupting.
No way.
Anthony Albanese.
How are you?
Hey,
Brad Hayes.
nice to see you.
Adam again.
Hey, mate. Going.
We're just talking cricket in here, Prime Minister.
Yeah.
The Batuta Advocate, a satire publication, is represented.
My mum raised me with three great faiths, Catholic Church, South Sydney Rugby League Football Club and the Australian Labor Party.
Now, as James Madden, who is the Australian's media editor, noted in the Media Diary, this was an absolute zinger when it was first dropped by Anthony Albanese around about 2014, I think. But he has said it quite literally hundreds of times in media interviews since then, and it's lost a little bit of the lustre that I think Albo thinks it carries. We've got some women's networks, and then there are what I would call smaller independent news and current affairs shows for both Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton.
I'm Mark Boris, and this is Straight Talk.
Peter Dutton, welcome to Straight Talk.
Mate, great to be with you. Thank you, mate.
Yeah, so let's talk about Peter Dutton. He gave a 90-minute interview in December to a former Olympic diver, Sam Fricker, who's got a massive YouTube audience. He's got about 6 million subscribers. And again, it was not a particularly challenging interview, was it?
No, it was a long interview, and it was, as far as I can tell, an attempt to kind of counter this emerging hard man persona that has come about around Peter Dutton, whether or not that's been fostered by him and by his team, or if it's something that's happened due to the circumstances. But it did seem that the audience that did watch this interview on YouTube wasn't necessarily buying it.
So my apologies for being so tardy in our arrival time.
Of course, thank you for coming in. And is that what campaigns are like, just moving around the country, talking to people? What's a day in your life look like at the moment?
Well, it is pretty much like that. So the election proper...
Yeah, which is interesting, isn't it? Because presumably you don't follow Sam Fricker to get politics, and you don't follow Sam Fricker to get just unfiltered politics, where it's just the endless repetition of talking points or worked up media lines. I wonder if that's the audience's irritation with it, that politics is actually quite boring.
Yeah, I wasn't actually familiar with Sam Fricker until Peter Dutton appeared on his podcast. His life after diving seemed to actually be quite diverse in terms of the paths that he has pursued. He does have a podcast which is called Diving Deep. He seems to interview people from all walks of life, but it's not in any way, shape or form specifically a politics podcast, nor is it a politics podcast that would really attempt to peel back those layers of those talking points and actually understand the policy that's at the heart of that agenda.
Coming up, where you've heard this all before.
Do me a favour, do you know Elon Musk? Yes. He endorsed me. By the way, he gave me the nicest endorsement, too. He said, the country's going to fail. You should do the same thing, Joe, because you cannot be voting for Kamala.
Joe Rogan is one of the biggest podcasters in the world. His show, The Joe Rogan Experience, regularly clocks up millions of downloads per episode. In November, Rogan got Donald J. Trump.
There's a lot of interest in it.
One of the things that
There's a lot of interest in the people coming from space, you know.
Yes.
And I know you're interested in that.
Oh, very interested in that. How much did they tell you about that?
A lot.
Trump's presidential opponent, Kamala Harris, appeared on another mammoth podcast, Call Her Daddy, hosted by Alex Cooper.
I saw the governor of Arkansas said, unfortunately, Kamala Harris doesn't have anything keeping her humble. How did that make you feel?
I don't think she understands that there are a whole lot of women out here who are not aspiring to be humble. A whole lot of women out here who have a lot...
Harris was talking to young women. Trump was talking to young men.
It was a friendly environment for Donald Trump, wasn't it?
It was probably also a pretty easy numbers play based on the fact that this is one of the biggest podcasts in the world. But it felt different, in my opinion, in the sense that Joe Rogan is so ideologically aligned with his audience, being predominantly young men. And we saw that reflected in the vote in America in November. Whether or not there's a causal link there, I don't think it would be fair to say that Joe Rogan's millions of listeners heard that interview and automatically switched to vote to Donald Trump or were compelled to vote at all because of it. But there is a difference there in that Joe Rogan is so ideologically aligned with his audience in a way that some of the Australian podcasts being engaged by Australian politicians don't necessarily seem to be. That feels more like a surface level demographic play.
Yeah, and the risk for those interviews is that in a very comfortable environment where you're not really being challenged, you reveal yourself to be not as likeable as you think you are. Kamala Harris appearing on Call Her Daddy, the big American podcast, relaxed enough to let herself talk quite freely about Donald Trump as a human being and said some things that maybe didn't win her any new voters and could potentially have turned some people off. That's the risk, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's presented to the audience as this opportunity to get to know the real you. And if there's nothing there for them to get to know, then why would you go and cast a ballot for this person who said that they can be the one to change your life or make your life better?
Kristen Amiot is producer of The Front. You can read all our coverage of the looming federal election anytime at theaustralian.com.au.